All right. So when we're discussing dating techniques, the biggest kind of thing that will come up again in quizzes and midterms and knowledge level for you all is that there's two kind of categories of dating within the field. One is absolute dating, which is very much lab science dating, um, very much more accurate in terms of dates. Uh, and they include things like radiocarbon dating or carbon 14. A lot of people have probably heard of radiocarbon dating. I'll give you the a little bit of a rundown. Radiocarbon dating is that carbon 14 is in the atmosphere that plants absorb, and then everything in the food chain essentially eats something of the carbon 14. When animals and or plants die, they're not able to absorb carbon 14 anymore. So there's a half-life to carbon 14, so it starts to break down. So that's the general process of carbon 14. It gets much more specific in the lab. What I will tell you is that carbon 14 in the last 20 years has become very, very accurate, and it is used for dating formerly organic material. The problem is that a lot of times organic material doesn't really last further back than 50,000 years, right? It basically turns into a fossil, which is a stone essentially, and you can't date that. So really, what you need is some form of organic material that has lasted, right? So when we found Neanderthal and Denisovian remains, there was enough organic material left in the bones that had not turned to silica or iron, and was there enough for us to pull the whole genome out of the DNA that was in those bones. And then again, we can use radiocarbon dating when we have organic material. Dendrochronography is dating tree rings, and the Bristol Cove pines here on the Eastern Sierras were vital in kind of figuring out how to do that and to get it more accurate. So again, every year, because of seasonality, basically certain trees have new tree rings. This becomes important when kind of dating things like buildings and whatnot, right? Because essentially people use wood for building structure, so the tree ring should be in that kind of building material. Thermoluminescence dating, a lot of these next ones are going to be high heat kind of dating to see quartz crystals and stuff like that. Again, they're very technical. I am not a lab anthropologist or archaeologist, so these things are a bit foreign to me. I would love to go kind of get some experience with them. Optical simulated luminescence is again another one of those very lab kind of high techy stuff. Electron spin resonance gets into dating. I think they date teeth with electron spin resonance, and it's also one of those a similar thing like dating kind of the enamel processes in teeth. Potassium argon dating is more similar to radiocarbon dating, which is potassium has a half-life and breaks down into argon. So again, with potassium argon dating, you can go back very far in the past, millions and millions and millions of years. So this is what we would be using in terms of when we find fossil remains of human relatives that were, around 6 million years ago or whatever. If they're associated with volcanoes or volcanic activity, that really helps us, and a lot of times they are. But remember, kind of the dating requires things to almost be perfect, right? Obsidian hydration is looking at obsidian stone tools and then using high level of water kind of pressure, and then to break that down and then also be able to date that in terms of when it was formed and created. Relative dating techniques are much more subjective, but they are also much more in the field observation. Serration is styles, so a lot of times people date things by style, right? If we have a different grouping of pottery, the Moche in Peru have this as well. People go through different style changes a lot of times, and that's serration, and a lot of times that's how it would be broken down. Stratigraphy is simply strata in the soil. So a lot of times, even if you're digging in your backyard, like the first layer might be sandy, then the next layer you start to get to rocks here and there. Eventually you might hit bedrock. That is strata. So stratigraphy or stratification, or the law of superposition even, is that everything lower in the ground and the lower strata is older than everything on top, which is newer, right? And that goes back to some uniformitarianism as well. And so the law of superposition again states that if we find tools way down, kind of buried in the bedrock, that those have to be older than what's on the surface. Now, in archaeology, we talk about a lot of various turbations, which are kind of messing with that relative dating stuff, which is a gopher could bring something essentially from the bottom, kind of sitting on the bedrock, up to the top, which is very old, and then we have to kind of do serration dating to say, oh wait, this is way older than a style than what the natives would have used in the last like 1,000 years. This is like 10,000-year-old kind of technology and stone tool use, right? Because we end up with a point that would be used to kill a mammoth rather than a point to kill a deer. So again, relative dating techniques are really used a lot in the field and are not as precise as the others. Provenience analysis is the idea that when you find things, when you're excavating, they only have meaning if they are in association with where you find them. For instance, if somebody's grandpa had collected a native stone tool in some other location and you have it in your garage, it has no provenience because it has no story. It is cool because somebody made it, but it has no story. It's not connected to the people that made it. It's not connected to the animals and the plants where it was found. So provenience is really keeping things in their place and maintaining that place in order to tell the true story. Okay, so when we get into Darwin, we really need to kind of move towards, what were the impetuses of Darwin kind of coming about? There were a lot of people around the time of Darwin, and even prior to that in the early 1800s and even kind of the later 1700s, that had started to question a lot of things during the Enlightenment era around the Judeo-Christian belief structure. And really what we have here is kind of the age of the earth, right, becomes the major debate. And the church, the kind of Roman Catholic Church, their priests had put out a lot of numbers, and the numbers really look like 6,000 years as how old the earth is 6,000 years. And I will tell you that I've read the Bible, and the date of 6,000 is not in any Bible that I've read included in the Bible itself. It is that theologians have looked at kind of how long the Bible is, and that's basically what they say is that the earth is 6,000 years old. And I don't know how many kind of religious groups are holding on to that number. Some people believe in that number. Fair enough. I don't judge if you believe in any different things than me, because I'm an anthropologist and I love everybody and their diversity, right? And if they weren't diverse, then we wouldn't really have anybody to study. However, when we're talking about kind of this scientific revolution during this time period, the dating and the Judeo-Christian belief structure is kind of dominating the public's opinion on how old the earth is and where did things come from and how did we get here. By the late 1700s, though, scientists start to believe that the earth is older and that just kind of like hunting around and looking at plants and animals. James Hutton in the late 1700s, he founds the modern field of geography because he's kind of dissatisfied with the biblical interpretations. Taxonomy as a term is the classifying of or study of identifying evolutionary relationships. Oh, sorry, I totally messed that up. Taxonomy is classifying of organisms into systems, right? So taxonomy is when we kind of break down the mammal kingdom and then we move into primates, right? And so that is kind of taxonomy. It's very much Latin language based, right? And we get Linnaeus is the one that gives us kind of this taxonomic system that we use currently. Systematics is the classifying and study of identifying evolutionary relationships between the various species, right? And that video on Darwin definitely goes into systematics for sure. Demography is the study of populations, features, and statistics like birth rate and death rate. These are all just terms that you guys need to be familiar with. Evolutionary biology, you'll get some overlap, right, which is the study and process of change in organisms. So evolutionary biology then kind of feeds into anthropology, to be honest, because there's a lot of overlap when we get into primates, which is at 65 million years. We have proto-primates, and that process of change really is informed a lot by evolutionary biology, which again, Darwin was kind of the founding member of, him Wallace. Uniformitarianism, I mentioned that earlier. Uniformitarianism as a theory is that the process in the geological past, right, which is um, the seasons, essentially. Seasons, and then what happens in those seasons is still at work today, right? And this is how the kind of whole purpose of like sedimentary rocks, which are rocks that are formed by different sediments coming together and together over time, and then kind of being pressurized and creating kind of their own structure, right? There's sandstone that are very kind of loosely organized. You can throw it against a wall and it breaks apart. But then you have kind of limestone that again is a sedimentary rock that you throw it against the wall and it might not break apart. Then there's chert that almost acts like glass that people use for stone tools because it's so hardy and can be so sharp, is also sedimentary rock. So the idea of uniformitarianism is really the idea of the processes of Earth have been the same over time. The opposite side of that is what we call catastrophism. And catastrophism is, again, and I'll skip ahead here, catastrophism is that the Earth was formed out of cataclysmic events like volcanoes, earthquakes, asteroids, all of those other things. And really what we have is kind of a shared idea here. If we know that an asteroid came and hit kind of in the Yucatan area and destroyed a huge swath of land and then disrupted the whole climate system, that then we have kind of the destruction of the dinosaurs, we could say that that absolutely changed the planet, right? And really what we're looking at is change, right? So uniformitarianism is change to the Earth over time. Catastrophism is change to the Earth abruptly, okay? Robert Hooke looks at fossil evidence using kind of the microscope to discover cells. Now we're into kind of, this time period. Cuvier is a pioneer of paleontology. He's looking at kind of extinct fossils and comparative anatomy, trying to relate, mammoth to elephant and whatnot. We get John Ray, and again, taxonomy based on physical appearance. So it's kind of like lumping in a horse with a zebra, okay? And then we get Linnaeus, I talked about him, zoologist, physician, creates our classification system. Thomas Malthus, he basically gives us kind of the resource restrictions. He believes that humans will basically run out of resources and kind of will kill ourselves off. It's the idea of carrying capacity, that species can't overeat, otherwise they die off. Lamarck in 1809, he posits that during life adaptation, right? He believes that animals stretch their neck more and more. The quintessential example is the giraffe, right? The way that the giraffe's neck got stretched was over time it kept stretching for more and more leaves, and then eventually its neck got really long, and then it passes down those genes. Erasmus Darwin is Charles' grandfather, who thinks in a Lamarckian way, so definitely that evolutionary style way. Blending inheritance is an outdated theory that phenotype of offspring is a uniformed blend of parents. So the idea here is that that your parents, you are an exact kind of blend of them and look like a middle realm of them, right? Like, which is not true. So it's kind of outdated. Gregor Mendel does his pea plant experiments and looks at phenotypes. So again, he gets into the idea of physical units, which is a genotype is 2 alleles or 2 traits. And I'll show you that when we get into the Punnett squares. But he looked at crossbreeding different pea plants and stuff. Thomas Huxley was Darwin's bulldog, and he promotes evolution and purported that humans evolved from an ape-like animal. So this is early on, 1800. Darwin puts out kind of The Origin of Species in 1859. So again, Huxley is one of the reasons why Darwin becomes way more popular than Wallace, even though Wallace is publishing essentially the same thing on natural selection that Darwin does at the same time. They're in communication. But Thomas Huxley is absolutely a Darwin supporter who goes out and does these university tours that really convinces everybody that Darwin's theory of evolution is Darwin's theory. So people and scientists begin traversing the globe. They start to, again, they hitch rides with now kind of the explorers that are moving all over the globe, and they're starting to ask interesting questions, right? Again, Darwin is a naturalist, so he's trying to find out kind of more the animal kingdom questions. But around this time, you start to move into even anthropologists, and you have missionaries. And so people are traveling the globe trying to stretch out, and either to give people that they're meeting in these far off places something like religion or help, or to discover something on their own.